Good evening. Welcome to this special science edition of Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Joining us tonight, Australia's chief scientist, Chubb. Molecular biologist, Suzanne, Cory, who's delivering this year's Boyer Lectures on the promise of science. Nobel Prize-winning immunologist, Doherty. Former Young Australian of the Year and founder of Robogals, Marita Cheng. And Nobel Prize-winning astrophysicist, Schmidt. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio. You can join the Twitter conversation using the Quanda hashtag. Remember, if you've got a live question, add @Quanda to help us find it. We asked our Facebook followers what they'd like to see discussed on Q&A tonight. They nominated the lack of a science minister, Australia's lagging science and maths literacy, and research cuts. Well, our first question comes from Robin Stutchbury.
Thank you. Good evening, panel. Science has lost funding, status and respect under the Abbott government. We haven't had a Minister for Science since 1931. Instead, we have a Minister for Industry who believes that he has enough background in science from his passion for science, his ancestry in science. I wonder whether perhaps that's why he calls scientists precious petals. It might be that passion. I'd like to ask the panel, why is it that scientists take these outrages so meekly? And why aren't science students and researchers marching on the streets in protest?
OK, I think we meant there that this is the first time we haven't had a Minister for Science since 1931. Doherty, why aren't scientists and researchers marching on the streets?
Well, we kind of like to do science. I suppose that's one reason. And I'm not sure that that's really our style, to be out there with placards. We did have a very effective kickback when the Gillard government cut or promised to cut medical research funding. And the Australian Society of Medical Research got medical researchers out there in white coats. And before long, the Gillard government looked as though it was killing babies, and that didn't do very well for it. But it's kind of hard to mobilise something like that around science in general. It's very diverse. We all try to communicate concerning the importance of science, but it's hard to cut through. So it's great to have this program tonight as hopefully getting some messages out. And
are you one of those precious petals that thinks there should be a science minister?
I haven't been that concerned about the absence of a science minister. I think the important thing for science is to have a powerful advocate in the cabinet. You can call such a person a science minister or not, but often science ministers in the past have been junior ministers who haven't had that much clout. Even our much-loved Barry Jones, who's a wonderful person and was a great advocate for science under the Hawke government. Eventually he was associated with John Button because John was a heavy hitter in the cabinet. So sometimes it's been a kind of way of putting science to a side by having a minor junior minister handling science. So that didn't worry me so much. I think Minister McFarlane is well motivated and interested in science, but I think Chubb is probably the person who can tell us most about that type of issue.
We might let you take my chair in just a minute, but I think I might actually throw that one to Suzanne first.
Yes, throw it to Suzanne.
Suzanne, why aren't scientists, researchers and so on marching in the streets was the question.
Well, first of all, Tony, I think scientists are actually steel magnolias, not precious petals. So it's just that we're working differently. We are working behind the scenes. We're trying to use persuasion. We're speaking to you tonight, the Australian people, to persuade you of the importance of science and science education for the future of this country. And we know that the politicians will be listening to us. Our leaders will be listening. We also have a wonderful chief scientist, a very strong chief scientist. He's leading the pack.
There seems to be a real consensus that you should have a go.
That's right. You should. Well, so I'm in the fortunate position where I can agree with both of my colleagues on the panel. I think the important issue for us is to get all the evidence that Minister McFarlane needs to take into Cabinet and be a champion for science in there. As Peter said, we've had many sorts of ministers for science over the years. I've been around so long now, as I've said in response to this question before, I've seen tall ones and short ones, fat ones and thin ones, competent ones, and so I'd rather have somebody...
How do you characterise the current one?
So I'd rather have somebody in whom we can depend and with whom we can walk together to try to get the message across of just how important science is. And I think, like Suzanne, I think that scientists are precious. I think they're precious to this country. I think the future of the country depends on the quality of the science that we can produce and the support that we can give our science, and we'll get that if we have somebody taking the message to Cabinet.
Ryan Schmidt, precious but not precious petals.
Yes, well, I think precious petal, I guess from someone who gets to give colloquia, for example, at Caltech, where that would be a compliment rather than, compared to the insults they normally fly when you present your research. It just, was not a useful comment, I think, by the minister. But I think we need to get out of the conversation of us throwing one-liners and saying, hey, we don't have a science minister, and him calling us precious petals. I think we really need to look at what are we actually doing in science. We need to have that conversation, and not just three-word slang matches, I guess, out in the media. They're not helpful.
Now, the questioner asks, with cuts and so on, shouldn't there be more outrage? Scientists meekly accepting what is happening.
As I said, compared to what we do every day in defending our ideas, being called that wasn't much of an insult, I'm afraid. It's just not that much. As I said, I don't think it was helpful. What we really want, and the reason I'm concerned, is that I see a lack of focus within the country, within government, successive governments, where we aren't focusing on the end game of actually improving how we do science. We just give it these tiny little, discursive discussions in the media, and then we move on and we won't talk about it for another 4 or 5 months. And that's all we get.
Marita, what do you think?
Well, I think that, comments like precious petals that may alienate the scientific community aren't always helpful. But I think what's important is that we have an advocate for the science community, and as long as they're advocating a strategy for science education in the country so that the next generation of kids in this country get to enjoy the wonders of science, get to learn about the wonders of maths, and learn about how they can apply that to make the world a better place, and that's what I'm concerned about. Okay,
let's go to our next question. It's from Martin Rees.
My question is to Susan Cory. In your recent Boyer lectures, you highlighted how fundamental or blue sky research has been critical in transforming our lives and economies, often in unpredictable ways. For instance, our investments in astronomy research has ended up giving us Wi-Fi. However, agencies that fund blue sky research have been targeted for massive cuts, including a $75 million cut to the Australian Research Council, where I'm applying for funding to continue my work on how inflammation damages our blood vessels. Younger, less established researchers like myself are most at risk from these cuts, and I'm facing the real prospect of having to leave research. So my question is, what is the cost when governments just pick a few winners in applied research and abandon broad support for blue sky research?
Suzanne.
Well, that's a question that I'm very happy to get, Martin. And first of all, I'd like to say, don't leave science. We need you. I think a very good example of the spin-offs that come from blue sky research is the Human Genome Project. Now, that was a big discovery project. Nobody dreamed what an impact that would have on the economy, but it had a 65-fold impact on just the US economy. So many businesses, industries have been transformed in medicine, in veterinary research, in medical technology. So a tremendous boost to the economy coming from something that set off as simply a desire to understand our genes and know how many we've got. And we could give you around this table many more examples where investing in big, important, basic problems eventually yield great fruit for humanity.
You're talking essentially about government investment here, because you made the point in your speeches, your lectures, it's fiscally irresponsible not to increase funding for science research.
Indeed. I did use those words and I will repeat them again. It is fiscally irresponsible for this country not to be investing more strongly in research. Research and development and science education are the future for this country. We're at a crossroads, I believe. We've been very good at sustaining our economy from our resource industries, and long may they continue to prosper. But we can do it even, we can't keep doing that forever. We've got to invent our own advanced manufacturing industries for the future. And that will come from research and development. That will come from science education. So we need it for our future. The rest of the world is not standing still. The rest of the world knows that the future is dependent on research and development. This country is neglecting that at its peril.
Well, you mentioned the rest of the world, and I'll come to the rest of the panel in a minute, but they can respond to a question related to that. It's from Matthew Baker.
Hi, panel. During my PhD overseas, I worked with a number of talented Chinese researchers who are now back in China as group leaders and professors. And one of them came to visit me recently and was very exuberant in detailing the level of expenditure on science in China at the moment. That they're building effectively a powerhouse of research for the next 20 to 50 years with the human talent, the work rate, the equipment, and the money available for science. Given that, why do we fund science in Australia at all? And as a devil's advocate question, why not outsource all experimental work to China? How can we compete with that expenditure? And
Peter Doherty.
how do we benefit from it?
I think the future of Australia is looking north. If we're going to have a bright future, we're going to be interacting with an emerging middle class, upper middle class in China and the countries to our north. Those people greatly value education, they greatly value science, they also value things like classical music. You'll visit and their sons and daughters are learning piano and they will give you a concert. So it's this area of our society which gains us respect in those cultures. And if we keep our science strong, we can be players. Our microbiology department in Melbourne, for instance, has interactions into Japan. We did a lot of work with a group in Shanghai when the big new H7N9 influenza virus came along. We're interacting with people in Singapore. Our future in this part of the world depends on having that high culture interaction. With respect to the other question about blue sky research. Now, the research that Martin mentioned, I wouldn't call blue sky research at all. Basically, I no longer talk about pure science or applied science. I talk about science and I talk about translating science. With modern molecular science, looking at a biomedical problem, and I can't speak to physics, of course, Brian can, but looking at a biomedical problem, doing the types of analysis we do, it's a very small step from discovery to going towards application. Once you make a gene discovery and you see that it's important and you've demonstrated that in what are really basic type of experiments, that can translate very quickly. Now, we talk a lot about translational research. We talk a lot about making money from it. That's great, but you have to have something to translate. And unless you've got that basic discovery, you have nothing to translate and you have no science.
So are you concerned about the government cuts that to research funding that Martin obviously sees
yes, of course
that have put his job on the line?
Of course I'm concerned, and I've been perhaps unduly critical about it. Tweeting is a bad habit. Some of us just shouldn't do it. We shouldn't do it, but nonetheless. And we are, I think, the only advanced country I know that has actually cut science. We've seen drops in science funding in the United States due to lack of increment, but they haven't actually gone in there and cut science. Now, the US in many ways is a very conservative country, and yet science is valued. It's valued by many members in the Republican right, and in fact, if you look traditionally at American science, it's often been the right that values it more than the left. The left likes to put money into social programs. Under John Howard, we saw 2 increases in the biomedical research budgets, and we saw 2 increases in the science budget. So I was actually flabbergasted. I'm not close to the to the levers of power, as some of us may be here. But I was flabbergasted when they actually came in and cut science, because it's such a dumb thing to do. And I am on record in Nature and various other places as saying these people are stupid. Now, they're not stupid. They're not stupid. They're politicians. They aren't stupid, and I believe we are starting to now have some dialogue between, for instance, our chief scientist and scientists and government. But they came in with an agenda, a shock and awe agenda, due to certain abnormalities, due to the fact of my home state of Queensland, where a certain mining magnate seems to have taken a big role. We've had some rather peculiar situations arise. Their shock and awe budget turned into a long, slow bleed, but we don't need to go into that. So,
Brian Schmidt, you've got two questions to address there.
So let's start with Matthew. So I think the question we have to address is, if China is doing all this work, then why do we need to do it? Well, we have to add value ourselves. So what are we going to do in the future? Or are we just going to be the dependents of China? Well, I don't think we're going to be the dependents, because they don't want to spend money on us. So we need to have something to bring to the table that's interesting. And Australia is an advanced economy. We have the ability to do all sorts of interesting, cool things where we can compete with anyone in the world on various areas where we have expertise. And we need to continue that, because those are the areas where we're going to add value to the economy and have something to trade in the future that's useful. So I think thinking that somehow we can do something else really means that we're going to be very much less affluent in the future than we are now, and that would be a problem.
And Brian, the question of blue sky funding and funding cuts to blue sky science research.
Yeah, so this comes down to a problem that almost every single politician I've ever met faces. They don't get how blue sky research translates eventually into economic benefits. The problem is, without blue sky research, you only invent what you already know. And the big gains are the revolutions. And if you're going to invent something you already know, that's what industry is really good at. So we really need to have government focusing on doing the stuff that industry doesn't do well, blue sky research, the first stages of translation, and then work on our industry policy where we can actually get industry and academia working together, which is a place where Australia performs phenomenally poorly on the world stage.
Marita.
Well, I think in terms of blue sky research, I mean, in any kinds of creativity, you need to experiment with weird and wacky ideas, and then bring ideas from different places and put them together and see what happens. I mean, that's how Wi-Fi was created, which is done very well for CSIRO in this country. In terms of outsourcing science, well, the mining boom, it's not going to last forever, and now's a perfect time for us to really take a step back and look at where we are right now in Australia. And where we are is we have a great foundation. We have the highest median wealth per capita. We're fifth highest in terms of GDP per capita. We're second in terms of the human index in the world. We have this great foundation. We're a great country, and what we need is an industry that will move our country forward, such that we can maintain this high standard of living that we enjoy today for many generations to come. And the only way that we can get there is by investing in science and investing in translating science through industry and bringing products into the world that we export to the rest of the world.
Ian Chubb, you're the chief scientist, so we presume you have the ear of the minister, although he's not a minister for science. He's interested in science, no question. When you saw the very large cuts to science that we just heard Peter Doherty say were foolish or stupid, what did you say?
I said I'm really disappointed in that minister. And I was. I mean, I think, as the colleagues on the panel have said, we're constantly told we're an economy in transition. What are we going to transition to? Where are we setting the vision for the country we want to become when we shift our economy from what it is to what it's going to have to be? And if we are willing to learn from the rest of the world and not presume that the rest of the world will do what we need, then we can look around and we find these careful, strategic, long-term commitments to science, innovation and so on all around the world. And I think that's what we've got to do. So my line is, there is no point in me going and banging on relentlessly about what a disappointment it was to see what happened. But what do we do now? And I think we have an opportunity to make the case, to rise as one and walk in the streets if necessary, although I don't think that would be particularly productive, but we could do it. But now is an opportunity to get a strategic reinvestment in areas of critical importance to this country. Australia tried outsourcing its research all the way up until 1946. We produced our first homegrown PhD graduate in Australia from an Australian university in 1948. Up until that time, we had very little research done in the country. There was some. There was the equivalent of CSIRO in an earlier form and so on, but the universities did research if they wanted to or if people in universities wanted to. And it became starkly clear in the 1940s, early 40s, that we didn't know what we needed to know to survive and prosper. And as a part of the rebuild Australia after the Second World War, the politicians and bureaucrats at the time said, we will not let this happen again. We will actually be contributors to the world of knowledge, the ideas that come from blue sky research. We will be contributors and we will have a seat at the table where the big decisions are made. That's where we've got to be. We won't be there if we're sitting outside the tent waiting for the crumbs to fall out. We've got to invest and we've got to do things that are important for the country, important for the people of the country, but also important for the positioning of Australia in the world, as Peter said. It's not simply about doing it because we feel good. It's about how do you make Australia take a place in the world as a great global citizen and a contributor to the ideas that will lead to the betterment of humankind. And that's an investment, and it's a long-term investment.
Okay, more on that shortly. Thank you. Our next question is a video. It's from Michael Fitzgerald in Abingdon in England.
I'm an Australian physics postdoc who has a permanent position in the UK, and I'm not alone. Off the top of my head, I can name about 10 from my generation who've ended up at places such as Cambridge, Harvard, and Oxford, and they're not coming back because of the lack of job security in Australian universities. If Australia is to have a future in the sciences, where are your academics going to come from?
Suzanne.
Well, I think it's a pity you're over there. You should come back. There's a lot for you to do back here. I think that in my field, in medical research, yes, there are many very fine Australian scientists around the world. Some of them are young, and it's really important for them to go around the world and learn at the feet of the very best labs and then come back with that knowledge to our country. Some of them went at particular times and they married abroad and stayed abroad, but they're not lost at all. They are our connections with the world. They are very valuable resources to us. You should also mention the number of Europeans, Japanese, Chinese, American scientists who come here to train, many of whom stay and live here. Science is an international endeavour, and it's a great opportunity for Australia right now, because we have a strong economy, that we can attract the best brains in the world to Australia to add to our enterprise. So the best brains will go where the best opportunities are, and Australia has to offer those opportunities much more strongly. In medical research, we've had a boom because of the increase in funding that Peter talked about. That's now flat, and we run the risk of not having the same attractive power. I can't speak for physics, Brian can speak for physics. But this is a moment of opportunity for us that we can attract the best. It's like the scientists going back to China and building China. We can not only bring back Australians who've trained overseas, we can attract the best brains from every country in the world.
Peter, that's a fine sentiment, of course, but that gentleman says he doesn't see jobs back here, so he's very worried about that, and he's quite happy, I think, to be somewhere where he sees jobs and funding.
Absolutely. That's scientists are opportunists. We work on the Willie Sutton model. Willie Sutton was a bank robber. He was quite well known and became quite fashionable. And after he got out of jail, he used to go to New York cocktail parties and stuff. And lady asked him, Mr. Sutton, why do you rob banks? He said, lady, that's where the money is. We're opportunists. We go where we can do the science. We're passionate about what we do. Petals, steel magnolias. I spent a lot of time in the southern United States. I know steel magnolias. We're not nearly as tough as that lot. You work where the resources are and where you can do your job. I've spent 25 plus years of my life working outside Australia, substantially in the United States. I'm back here now at the end of my career doing what I can to help. One good thing the government did under Minister Pine, continued the Future Fellowships, which are a good program. But the problem is this: science is a long-term activity that builds over many years. When we cut a science budgets in the way we did, we do enormous damage because you knock out that oncoming generation. It's always the younger people who get hit, the ones who don't have secure tenure and so forth. So they'll either move out or they'll do something else. We really do need bipartisan strategy on science in Australia. I don't know how we achieve that, but it would be a wonderful thing if we could do it. I think the way our parliament is operating at the moment is very, very silly. And we need to change it somehow. Right. I don't know how we do it.
So, I mean, the ideal solution for a scientist is to have a huge number of Australians going overseas and a huge number of foreigners coming in and having an exchange of ideas. That's what science is all about. It's about taking ideas and building on everything in the world so that you can get the most knowledge the fastest. So Peter mentioned the Future Fellowships. Great program, but it's being restricted only for Australian citizens and residents now in the current round. And that is guaranteeing a brain drain because we can't actually bring the foreigners in. And so we're going to lose people and not be able to get the people back in. So it's actually counterproductive.
Marita, why isn't business taking up the slack? I mean, we keep talking about government, but of course there's an awful lot of science done for and by business throughout the world. Is that happening in Australia?
Well, unfortunately not. Australia doesn't have high rates of communication between universities and business. Universities and industry just don't seem to talk to each other in Australia, and it's a real shame. It's a real cultural shame, and it impacts industry very heavily. Industry in Australia aren't innovating to the same degree that other countries around the world are, and that has an impact because it means that we can't create products that are attractive to countries overseas for us to export and create jobs and an economy through.
Is that a problem for the government or for business itself or for the scientists who aren't making the connections?
Well, it's a problem for everyone, really, which is why I think that Professor Chubb's strategy for getting universities, industry, government, everyone to communicate, to come up with a cohesive plan and strategy such that all these people talk, all these people know what's going on, and once we have the data, then we can know where exactly the pitfalls are and create a plan to overcome them.
Ian, that is an obvious throw to you. I mean, you have come up with a science strategy. We haven't had one for a while. In fact, plenty of people have been complaining about that.
Well, Tony, I think it's critically important in my view. And some of the comments that the colleagues have made point to it, and the question indeed points to it. The problem is that most of our approach to this over decades now has been based on short-term terminating programs or offset funding. You know, if you want to fund that, you've got to find where to take it from in order to fund that. And that is, I think, the antithesis of a strategic approach to the whole issue. We don't have priorities like most of the other countries in the world where we actually have a real national need. And we produced some, reproduced some data that the OECD had prepared, which showed that of 33 countries ranked in order of their cooperation, universities to business, Australia ranked 33rd out of 33. We were about 4% of our large ones and 4% of our small to mediums. Number 32 was Mexico at about 10%. The UK was at about 40%. Now the UK is important in this context because we have a similar profile of researchers. We each have about 60% of our researchers in the universities, about 10 or so percent bit over 10% in the publicly funded agencies, research agencies, and the rest in business. And Britain's about the same, but they're at 40% and we're at 4%. What have they done? They've been strategic. They've had a strategy. They've had a strategy to encourage it. They've put incentives in place to encourage it to happen, and they've taken a long-term view of the funding. So people can be comfortable that there are jobs, because we're not running everything off a terminating program that's got 4 years, and no matter how well it works, it stops. Or you go back into budget and it's offset funded, so you've got to find funding somewhere else. So I think that we've got to sit back and say, look, if we want to do this properly, if we want to position ourselves well, we have to take a whole of government strategic approach rather than the much more piecemeal approach that we've got used to over 20, 30 years.
Okay, Suzanne wanted to get in there briefly.
I didn't want to at all contradict what Ian was saying. I was just wanting to point out that we in Australia have had two very strong ways of bridging between academia and industry, and they are CSIRO and the cooperative research centres. Unfortunately, both of those programs, which I think are incredibly important for this country and will be very important if we're going to increase our translation, they were both cut in the last budget. So I think that...
Have you calculated the sum of those cuts?
I have, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. But it's been over the last 3 years that we've had successive cuts, and as somebody said,
Because it actually started under the Labor Party. I think Kevin Rudd cut $63 million from CSIRO in his very first budget.
Yes, so, but both the CRCs and CSIRO had substantial cuts in this last budget. If we're looking to increase translation and create new industries, that was foolhardy.
So we have to strategically reinvest is basically the issue, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think even in business, what you focus on is what you get. I mean, if you're going to focus on the metrics that you have is what is the results that you get. And I think it all comes down to a lack of vision in this country. We don't know where we're going, so we can't get there because we don't even know. So what we're doing is we're just putting bits of money everywhere, hoping that something will work out. But the actual strategic thing to do would be to be determinate, optimistic, which is where you believe that the future will be better than the present, and you have a plan for getting there. And once you have that vision, and once you say, this is the plan, this is how we're going to get there, then providing money to various pockets of research is easy, because it will mean that in 30 years we get to where we want to go.
Peter, is that the issue, lack of vision?
I think it's a number of issues. I think it's the lucky country problem a bit. You know, we're cursed with mining wealth, which I mean, it's great for us, but it really means we don't take on challenges as we might. A lot of industry is not very science focused. We have a big, there's quite a lot of activity within the mining industry that produces a lot of science and product within their industry, but it doesn't go out to the universities very much. We haven't succeeded in building those strong interactions between universities and entrepreneurial activity. I'm not sure what the problem is with... You're an entrepreneur, so you know something of it, but...
Well, I've actually got a grant going with a university at the moment, and it's not easy.
I'm taking your job again.
It's not easy, but yeah, we toil on.
We need to grow a more entrepreneurial spirit. We need to have mechanisms for funding that. We have some science success stories. I mean, CSL, for instance, is a success, a business and science success.
Although, ironically, their big new facility they're now building in Switzerland. And that's a massive loss to Australia.
We have to deal with the fact that this whole thing is globalised, and when you talk about a seat at the table, it's an international table. Yeah. That's one thing we absolutely have to keep, is our seat at the table. There are elements in government, I think, that think, well, we're early adopters, we can always pick this stuff up. But you can't pick the stuff up if you don't have the basic scientific insights and contacts. You need contacts. That's enormously important. So if we're not doing the science, we're out of it. We're you know, as Lee Kuan Yew said, we turn into the poor white trash of the South Pacific. And that's what we all want to avoid. We have to have some long-term plan and some new dynamic in this.
Universities like Stanford University, that I had someone tell me that in the 90s they went to a lecture where 3 PhD students from Stanford gave their talks about their research, and every one of them said, and here is my business plan for how we're going to commercialize this research. And so perhaps that's what we need to inject in our universities here.
That's the MIT model. It's
the Stanford model.
Okay,
and they've done very well out of it.
We're going to move on to a different subject. You're watching Q&A Science. Next question comes from Heather Nelson.
I'd like to ask Suzanne Cory a question in relation to what I term generational cancer. On my husband's maternal side of the family, there appears to be an unusually high percentage of his relatives who have fallen victim to cancer. I have 4 children in their 40s now and 7 grandchildren, and you can understand my concern and why I'm seeking answers. How close is a cancer cure?
Suzanne, tough question.
Well, Heather, it's a tough question, but I think that it's a question to which we can give very strong positive answer to, at least for some cancers. Let me say, first of all, cancer is not a single disease. It's at least 100 diseases, probably more. And every single cancer has molecular changes in it. We're learning more about the molecular changes that cause particular cancers. As we identify those molecular changes, we are designing precision medicines to tackle those fundamental causes of those cancers. And there have been major success stories for several cancers now, but unfortunately not all. There are, for example, chronic myeloid leukemia has a magic bullet drug that has totally transformed the lives of patients. They live normal, healthy lives for years and years, most of them. That is a drug that is targeted at the specific molecular accident that causes that disease. But we have no cures for some dreadful cancers such as pancreatic cancer or brain gliomas. So there's a lot of work to do. We know, you talked about families with susceptibility to cancer. We know a lot more about the genes, the particular gene forms that can cause a family to have a history of cancer. So certain tests are available for families to find out, and then those families can make particular lifestyle changes that might decrease the probability, because it's not a sentence, it's just a raising of the odds.
The promise here, of course, is for personalised medicines that tackle
Indeed.
individual cancers in individuals, but of course they are going to be very, very expensive. And so I'm just wondering, are we going to reach a situation, or do you worry that we'll reach a situation where wealthy people can afford the medicines to cure them of their cancers and others can't?
I think you raise a very interesting and important question, Tony. I think that in our society we're doing our best to let that not happen. First of all, it is very expensive to develop these new drugs. It's expensive because it is required that we have clinical trials to test whether or not those drugs are doing a good enough job with patients to warrant society investing in those drugs. Those trials cost a lot of money, but they're the only way that we can test to see whether those drugs really are the medicines that we should have. Eventually, when those drugs go off patent, they become cheaper, and so everybody gets access to them. But I do worry about the future. Our ability to diagnose and understand the molecular causes of many different cancers, I think, is progressing faster than the amount of money that pharmaceutical companies have to develop the drugs that might tackle those problems. So I think we've got to get smart. This involves the scientists. We've got to get smarter at designing and developing drugs more cheaply. and failing the ones early that and not letting them to go into clinical trial, which is where all the money comes from. Peter's probably got some comments about this as well.
Well, I mean, this is an issue right across the biomedical enterprise. We have enormous power in our hands now through molecular medicine, structural biology, the type of thing that's done at the synchrotron, for instance, in Melbourne, where we can actually identify the structures that are interacting that go wrong in cancer. And Suzanne was involved in very important work on this much earlier in her career. We can design those small molecule drugs that fit into those sites, and that's the type of thing that she's talking about, designer drugs. Now, we can do a lot of that. We can do a lot of it in cancer. Cancer, it's a little easier at times because when people are very seriously ill, you can waive a lot of the testing requirements because, you know, the do no harm thing, they're harmed anyway. But it's much more difficult with, say, antiviral drugs, the economic case for developing drugs that will block viruses. And we see that with Ebola because there was a vaccine available for Ebola, experimental vaccine, a decade ago, and it hasn't been developed because of the economic case wasn't there. We can't have this situation where we're making discoveries through the public sector, which is what happens with a lot of the discovery. It's through publicly funded science, and this is the case with the Ebola vaccine developed in the United States. But then we expect industry to develop this and take this forward. Well, they won't take it forward, and they can't if there's no economic base to do that.
So what do? Wait until you get an outbreak that's big enough that it becomes profitable to do?
We have to decide on a different model. I mean, we had Gates Foundation pouring money into this thing recently, but if we had that Ebola vaccine, we'd be in much better shape than we are at the moment. So there's a big issue here. There's big issues around economics. There's big issues around ethics of the application of a lot of the new information, big issues on when you know about cancer genes and so forth, how much do you disseminate that information, both within families and more broadly. Insurance, if you know you've got a cancer susceptibility gene, how does that affect your capacity to get life insurance? If you don't tell people that you've got this cancer susceptibility gene, then you're withholding information. There's a lot of ethical and moral issues as well as economic. But we need to face these and we need to be part of that discussion.
Let's move on to a completely different subject. We've got a question from Peter Irvin.
Thanks, Tony. I have a question on science for my son Lachlan, actually. His question is for Brian Schmidt, because he's very interested in physics. He's starting high school next year. And his question is, how can something as infinitely large as the universe actually get bigger?
Yes, this is always a problem, infinity getting bigger. So if you think of the universe, and when we measure the universe, it, as near as we can tell, is very close to being infinite in size. That is, we can only see 13.8 billion light years of it, because that's how old the universe is. But we're pretty sure there's a lot more universe beyond the part we can see, which light just simply can't get to us. And our measurements are such that we actually think that very nearly that may go out well, thousands of times beyond what we can see, and perhaps an infinite distance. So imagine you have an infinite universe, which I say is expanding. Well, that universe is actually embedded in 4 dimensions. It's this way, it's that way, and then there's time. And so as the universe gets bigger, essentially we are moving in this 4-dimensional space, and we're sort of where something else was in the past, but we're in the future. And so we're progressing in this 4-dimensional space in the future. And I always say there's a problem with 4-dimensional space. It's very hard to visualize. And indeed, I've never met a sane person who can visualize 4 dimensions, and you don't want to be one of the people who can. So ultimately, we're expanding into the future. But think of it this way. In school, you have done this little experiment in math where you'll put a ray starting at 0, and it'll go out 1, 2, 3, and off to infinity. You put a little arrow. It goes off forever. Now, I can multiply that by 2. So 0 stays at 0, 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 4, 4 goes to 8, And you can do that for any number you want, all the way up to infinity. And that's sort of what the universe is doing. Infinity is just getting bigger, and we're allowed to do that in mathematics. That's what's so cool about math.
Brian, your Nobel team not only proved the universe is expanding, but at an accelerating rate, and that seems to be critical, but what does it mean? What's the implications?
Well, it means that the galaxies that we see are moving away from us faster and faster, such that eventually they will be moving so fast away from us that the light they emit will no longer be able to reach us. So we will be in the future looking out into a universe which is literally void of galaxies. Our own galaxy, it turns out, is not expanding because we have a lot of gravity here and it quit expanding 13.5 billion years ago. But the rest of the universe will be accelerated out of sight, and so I will be unemployed in the future because there'll be nothing left to look at.
Yes, you probably won't be around to see it. Peter, you made a point, I think, a quiet point to me while Brian was speaking.
Well, you know, I told you early on, physicists are the smartest people on Earth, and, you know, there you have it. So.
I think we can see why people are very interested in science. Our next question is also about that subject from Sonia Kim.
Hello. Does science have a marketing problem? Because I've seen preschoolers absolutely be enthralled by a simple volcano experiment by the sandpit, and yet I don't see them studying science at schools or universities in droves. So what can be done, not just by government, but by parents, scientists, and perhaps the media, to ignite and sustain a passion for science?
Let's start with Marita there.
I mean, I've founded Robogals. We go out to schools with robots, teach girls how to build and program robots. And what we found is that kids really respond to why. Why are we doing this? Why are we making this robot move around? And we tell them, well, there's an animal, it's an environmental disaster. We're building this robot to go and rescue it. You're building this robot to transport medicine from one side of the hospital to another so that a busy nurse doesn't have to. And when they get that context and they get it in their world, in their terms, in their language, they think, wow, you know, I can do this. I can use this to make a difference. But I think even more importantly than that is to have that big vision, that big dream. When America put the first man on the moon, the average age of the engineer working at NASA at the time was 28. And so when JFK made that declaration, they were in their teens. They were at that point when they were thinking, what should I do at university? And they would have chosen engineering, possibly because they were inspired by that grand vision, that chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that's what Australia needs. We need a grand vision, something that propels us forward and has us seek this future. And that's what I do every day in my life. I build robot arms, and it, you know, I put all my time, all my money, all my energy into building these robots, and people just think I'm crazy. But I think in the future there are going to be robots in the world, and I want to be part of creating that future. And so that's what I'm doing. And we need that kind of mania across the whole country.
Can I just ask why, as a young girl, did you get involved with building robots?
I was just inspired by the technology entrepreneurs. When I was in my teens, I read about the Google guys and Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and sitting there reading my Time magazine, I thought, oh my gosh, they were 21, 25, they were studying their PhD, early 20s, and they dropped out because they saw an even bigger opportunity to make an impact in the world. They dropped out, they founded Google, they founded Apple, and I thought, you know, they're only in their 20s. I want to make a difference. If I study hard, if I try my hardest, maybe when I'm in my 20s, I can go out there and make a difference. And I think other young people in Australia, all across Australia, can do the same. There's no doubt in my mind that the next Google, the next Apple, the next Facebook can come from Australia. We have the foundations. We need the vision. We need to build on what we have to go forward.
Still on this subject, before I bring in the others, let's go to another question on this same issue. It's from Dewashish Bania.
Like going off the question, I think us students are the future of science and of Australia. What do you think the schools and the government can do to increase like us getting more involved in science?
Peter, what do you think?
Well, one way, we've got more people into science at the University of Melbourne by creating the Melbourne model, so they can't get into medical school unless they do science first. That's one way of doing it. And that allows people like me to have a go at them and say, you know, keep your math up, because a lot of the opportunities in biomedical science are actually in mathematical areas, computational areas, what we call informatics and so forth. That goes right across the spectrum. What's happening in science is everything is coming together. Physics, chemistry, medicine, biology, everything comes together. And so those skill sets that people thought maybe they don't need to do if they're going to be a doctor or a medical researcher now become very important. With respect to getting people involved in science, I think the fact that young people are now so involved with online mechanisms makes all sorts of possibilities. For instance, there was a computer game out there called Fold It. And it was a group at the University of Washington in Seattle who were putting out structures and asking people who are gamers, not scientists, gamers, all sorts of people who love to play this stuff, to work out mechanisms to fold these proteins. Some of these guys who had nothing to do with science ended up as authors on scientific papers. So I think that by making science much more visual, which we can do online with suitable animations and so forth, and by going to a more crowd science model. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, like you guys were saying, like the government's cutting all the fundings in science, and like that's gonna tell our students to not go into science because no money. What's the point of going in? And like, how can the government change that so like for our students it can be more advertised, like for us to go in?
Well, you know, one way is have the government change it, another way is change the government. I would. And I don't mean this. A good place to start would be to change the thinking of the present government. But I think one thing to do is get everyone out there to vote. There's a lot of young people, particularly. I believe there's 400,000 young people who are not registered to vote. I think we need to get people registered to vote. That's a good start.
And we've got a long time till the next election, so maybe it's a good idea to influence the current government. Ian, you've got a plan.
Well, we do, and I think that it goes to a number of the issues that have been touched on here, because science does have a marketing problem. There's no question about that. The manner in which we get across the sheer awesomeness of science is often too muted. We're not constantly out there. We see single events as being enough, and so, as I'm constantly saying to scientists, you know, just because you have a symposium or a press release or a press conference, that's not enough in itself. You've got to keep at it. There's passion, there's persistence, and there's a real sort of need for patience because, you know, as I've said before, this is not like, you know, buying a toothbrush when you get there because you forgot to pack one. We've got to actually do this and take the long run at it. So
Ian,
we're
fast running out of time. Let me bring you to something that you've proposed in this field, and that is that every government should commit to a plan where each primary school has dedicated mathematics and science teacher.
Yep. Well, that's where it begins. Carl Sagan, a famous US astronomer, the other one, one of the other ones, sorry. He once said that we take these young children who are totally curious and we then progressively beat it out of them. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is to maintain the sense that they can go to primary school and they can get shown science visually, how it's practiced, not taught out of a book, not just, you know, follow me, this is a principle, why? Well, it doesn't matter, just learn it. That they're actually shown the awesomeness of science from a very early age. And when that happens, all the evidence is it sticks.
Speaking of all the government approaches, have you run this past Christopher Pine? Because he would probably argue the states need to figure this one out.
He might, and he and I would agree, I'm sure, that there's a national interest issue here too. And this does actually require the national government and the state governments, state and territory governments, to talk seriously about how we're going to take this forward. Otherwise, it just won't happen.
Suzanne, briefly, Suzanne.
So every scientist I know who's been inspired to be a scientist has been inspired through a teacher. So teaching science well at school is the way to inspire the next generation of scientists. It's also absolutely critical to have a scientifically literate community. But science is still taught the old chalk and talk way, often by teachers who have not been trained in the subjects in which they're forced to teach. So we need to invest in this country in training more and better science teachers and give them the resources to teach with. And we need to teach them, we need to show them we need to teach our students by doing science, which is what you were saying. And the government has invested in 2 programs that the Academy of Science has developed over the last 10 years. There's a Primary Connections program and there's Science by Doing for junior secondary schools. Those programs are totally transforming the way science is taught in schools. They need to be in every school in this country.
Okay, there's time for one last question. This one's from Jackie Hepner.
Many scientists despair that public acceptance and action on climate change doesn't reflect a scientific consensus. It's now been 25 years since the first World Climate Conference, yet the public is more divided than ever, and predictions for the effects of climate change get more dire. If winning people over with more facts and less opinions was plan A, what's plan B?
Brian, let's start with you.
Well, I'm afraid that the climate's going to actually convince everyone here pretty quickly. The evidence from the warming of the oceans is going to become, I think, in the next 10 years, pretty convincing, so that most of the reasonable skeptics are going to drop out. That's unfortunate because that means the planet is warming. All that I can say is that ultimately we need to convince the people of Australia because they vote. And in the end, 30% of Australians or more don't yet accept climate change. And so that's where the education has to come, so that they don't feel the need to vote people in who feel the same way. So it's an education problem.
And so could I just add to that?
Yeah, sure.
And I would say part of Plan B is to present the evidence in a way that's accessible to people who are interested but not necessarily trained in the disciplines of science. And that's where the message has got to go. And I think that we started the run too late in that we said, you know, all of this work was done, it was kept largely, not exclusively within the scientific community, then it suddenly gets dumped on the public that this is a real problem that we've got to address right away. We should start earlier, we should work progressively through it, take the public with us as we go, and but we do need to make sure that it's not the typical techo and scientific talk, but it is in fact, without at all being patronising, but simply saying, these are the real facts, this is what it means, these are the implications, and we need to do something about it. So I think it's Plan A stroke B, because it's still about putting facts out there in the public. It's how you do it, how long you take, the patience and the persistence not to stop, just say, I think this is happening and therefore you should believe it. You have to actually work hard to take the public with you, and as Brian said,
not only the public
and politicians,
well, politicians, but also Tony Abbott's chief business advisor, Maurice Newman. I mean, you found yourself recently giving him a kind of lesson in science. Were you offended by his suggestion that science of global warming is like a religion, deaf to contrary evidence?
I was personally offended by it, and I was offended on behalf of the scientific community. I thought that that was a poor approach, and it does not contribute to a sensible debate about a very important issue that affects the whole of humanity, all living things on the planet. We've got to get serious and stop name calling.
Is science... Has science been damaged by this debate and by the way it's been conducted?
I think there are people now who would be persuaded by some of the arguments that have been put forward, which is because it's hard to counter the evidence. We actually measure things. We measure the heat content of the ocean, the temperature. We measure the pH of the ocean. We see it going down. We measure the CO2 going into the atmosphere. We know CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We've put 2 trillion tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere, half of which is still there, quarter in the oceans, quarter in the land. We know that. That's happening. So let's talk about what you do about it. There is a lot to be done. There is a lot to work out. There are things that are happening all the time. It's a very complex system with lots of variables all bouncing off each other all the time. But we do have to do something which draws this to a sensible conclusion, and not just, you know, silly words like it's a new religion or a delusion or somehow the scientists are all frauds or it's groupthink. I mean, this is fundamentally nonsense. And we've just got to recognise it as such, work around it and go on and get things done.
We're nearly out of time. We've got time for brief thoughts on this from our other panellists. Suzanne.
Climate change is the most important thing facing the future of this planet. And we need action throughout our society. It's not just the responsibility of the politicians, it's the responsibility of the citizens, the young people, the old people of this country. We've got to stop, we've got to phase out our reliance on fossil fuels. We've got to invest in green energy. We've got to stop cutting down our forests. We've got to invest in industries of the future that are going to recycle all of the materials on this planet. It's absolutely fun. This planet is so beautiful. It's absolutely essential for our physical well-being and our spiritual well-being. We are endangering all the species on the planet. We've got to do something about it. We've got to do it quickly and we've got to do it thoroughly.
Peter.
To use a medical analogy, the diagnosis is clear. The exact progress of the disease will take is not necessarily that clear. It's enormously complex. But what we need to do now is think about treatment and the preventive medicine of the planet. We need all of us to think about duty of care, because we've got the duty of care of the planet, of every other life form on it, and duty of care for future generations. So duty of care, not doctrinaire.
I'm sorry to say that's all we have time for. Please thank our panel, Ian Chubb, Suzanne Cory, Peter Doherty, Marita Cheng and Brian Schmidt. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next Monday on Q&A, we'll focus on building the infrastructure and cities for Australia's future. Joining the panel, Assistant Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development, Jamie Briggs. The Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, Anthony Albanese. The Lord Mayor of Perth, Lisa Scafidi. The former Lord Mayor of Sydney, Lucy Turnbull. And Architecture and Planning writer, Elizabeth Farrelly. Until then, good night.